Hello, everyone, and welcome to my weekly digital talk. Today, I have invited two distinguished guests, but you see right now only one of them, as we were trying to establish a connection with my other guest. Maybe we will manage to get him on the phone. Welcome to Dr. Michel Belfer. He is a president and director of research of the Eurogulf Information Center. He is senior lecturer at the Metropolitan University in Prague, Czech Republic. And he is also chief editor of the Central European Journal for International and Security Studies.
Evelina, I'm here if you can
by
hear
the way,
me.
Yes. Hello. Hello, Michel. We were just about to introduce our guest. So I think that we lost him once again. We will just keep going, and if manages to enter the digital talk, it will be great.
Evelina, can you hear me? I'm here.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay.
We hear you, yes.
Okay.
So Professor Michel Tong is on the line, on the phone line. Unfortunately, we could not establish a connection with him because of, internet. And as you can see, all of us are in this dire situation of trying to somehow go online. Professor Michel Tong is Senior Associate Fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, and he teaches in the International Relations Program of the University of Navarra, Pamplona, Spain. He holds a PhD from Harvard University and was a fellow at Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. He's also a non-resident affiliated scholar at the Center for Strategic Studies at Başkent University, Ankara in Turkey. So today's topic of my weekly digital talk is the COVID-19 and the Middle East. Obviously, the pandemic, the falling oil prices, and the dire economic situation are having a major impact on the MENA region, on the Middle East and North African region. So for most of the countries in this region, especially the ones which are fragile and conflict-ridden, such as Iraq or Syria, Yemen, Libya, the pandemic is a massive short-term impact challenge that is aggravating existential structural weaknesses, and is accelerating potential tensions and conflict lines, but might also trigger further cleavages and crises in the mid and long term. And all of this is going to be part of our talk in the next 60 minutes. So I'm going to start immediately with the first question, which is related to Iran. So tensions resulting from the Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure, coupled with Tehran's maximum resistance response of escalating in the region and ramping up, so has been actually escalating in the region and has been also ramping up its nuclear program. So these two programs, these two approaches led to almost 3 times full-fledged conflicts in the past year, right? With the last one in January. And against this background, I would like to ask you, how do you see Iran's positioning in the region once the COVID-19 crisis is over? We know that Iran was hardly hit by the virus outbreak. And I would also like to ask you, how do you see the Iran-US relations, but also Iran-Europe relations in this context, in the post-COVID-19 context? So, Mitch, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that. You can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's first, thank you so much for having me as your guest today. I look forward to our dialogue. I look forward to dialoguing with Michael and with our audience, of course. Just to fast forward a little bit into the Iran story, I think it's, from my point of view, it's good to talk about a kind of sub-state geopolitics, because very often people think of Iran as a regular country following a regular set of strategies. But actually, I would like perhaps to draw attention to the fact that Iran has built itself as an asymmetric military power, in the sense that it prioritizes the use of proxy groups, the use of insurgencies, terrorism, as a way of leveling the proverbial battlefield. And in that sense, it's very comfortable with using this kind of clandestine networks in pursuit of its goals. You rightly said that over the past 18 months, we've come very close into a collision course with Iran. Made much worse in January, where we were as close as possible to an armed conflict between the United States and Iran after the targeted assassination of Soleimani, the Al-Quds commander who was assassinated in Iraq. All this, comes together now with the COVID crisis, because Iran, and I think some very fundamental questions are going to have to be asked about the nature of Iran's regime, how they viewed the COVID crisis from the beginning, and what are we going to do about it? Because essentially what Iran has done, and for those who haven't seen it, I invite you to look at the BBC investigative reportage that was just released last night into the Mahan Iran Airlines and the use of that airlines to essentially spread the COVID virus throughout the region. This was a deliberate action by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But I mean, for Iran observers, that this is not something that's special. This is, something, of course, that they would exploit. And because they're exploiting the kind of regional and international turbulence to try to better their position. Basically, the way that Iran is positioning itself for a post-coronavirus world is the same way it was positioning itself for a coronavirus world or a pre-coronavirus world, and that is to become a regional hegemon. Almost everything that it's seeking to do is based on reinforcing its geostrategic position, and the only way to do so is by undermining the existing kind of, let's say, system that stabilizes the region. So it wants to make sure that the United States is gone out of the region. It wants to make sure that Europe isn't investing in other parts of the region. And so it's really prioritized striking US European interests in the region to try to make them indigestible, or their protection indigestible to Europe and the United States, inviting them to leave then the region, at which point Iran would further exploit it. I don't want to go into great detail about that now. I want to give space a little bit to Michael.
If he's here, right? Because I have an additional question related to what you've just said.
Sure.
Yes. Michael, can you hear us? Actually, I think he's out once again. Well, what interests me particularly is how do you see the relation between Iran and United States on the one side, and obviously there is a cleavage now in terms of the relation between Iran and Europe on the other side, as we saw that the key European member states, even after Brexit negotiations, UK still joined the common position, which is that they still want to back the JCPOA, the Iran deal from the perspective of the European geoeconomic interests. Is this something that really plays out in terms of long-term engagement? And do you see that there will be a cleavage between the partners of the transatlantic community when it comes to, dealing with
I'm here.
Iran? Yes, hello, Michael.
Hi.
Hi, we were just discussing Iran, so you actually didn't miss a lot, except for Michel's input. We were just dealing with the question of the relations between the United States and Iran on the one side, and Europe and Iran on the other side, and how this cleavage in the transatlantic community, if you like, when it comes to the future of of engagement, when it comes to the dealing with Iran, is going to play out. So, what is your take on that?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, hello to everyone. Hello, Mitch. I heard part of Mitch's comments. And let me wish each of you and your families and everyone listening that everyone should be safe and healthy at this time. And thank you for joining. I would like to remind everyone, in terms of when thinking about Iran and COVID-19, is that before the COVID-19 crisis, there were massive protests on the streets in two waves. If you remember, there were after the wave of protests in Iraq and Lebanon, there was the wave of protests that took everyone aback in Iran itself. And it was widespread. It was not just in Tehran. It was in the hardest hit economic areas. And it was not just, it was common people. It was not the elite. And it was the economic problems were directed at the regime. Protesters were burning pictures of Khamenei. And then there was the Soleimani assassination. Soleimani was assassinated, and then we saw these big funerals, and there was a debate if this helped the regime or not. But then there was a second wave of protests after the Iranian fiasco with the downed airplane and the Iranian cover-up and the use of the airplane as like a human shield. And that led to a second wave, and that wave of protests really ended because of COVID-19. So when we think about what the post-COVID-19 Iran picture will look like, we have to remember that discontent didn't go away. Because of COVID-19, it's estimated that 1 to 2 million Iranians have lost their jobs. And whereas the projections for Iran's economy to contract were 9%, now they're at 15% contraction of the economy. So all of this is going to be blamed on the regime. And Iran is in a very volatile situation because the reform movement has no credibility. So, and Iran is facing elections coming up. So all of these factors will affect the Iranian regime. And then, just to balance its budget, Iran needs an oil price of $390. So even if China buys Iranian oil, the price that they will buy it is very low. So what we're looking at is a regime that has very limited resources. It's overstretched in its activities in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And we should, IRGC takes about 25% of Iran's economy or controls about it. So I think Iran will face very important questions about how much it decides to continue its foreign operations and how much it decides to put in the domestic economy for regime security. So I wanted to lay out those. I didn't hear them yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. The thing is that I still would like to stress the importance of the post-COVID-19 scenario. So I really would like to hear from you and from and from Michel also why, in which kind of direction do you see that the bilateral relations will be going? Will we be facing a kind of a normalization in the US-Iran relations, because everyone is coping with severe economic situation due to the virus outbreak. So it applies to every country, big or small, weak or strong. So I think that there will be probably some kind of an interest on both sides to at least postpone, let's put it that way, to postpone the tensions and try to somehow come up with, with a normalization phase. We have presidential elections in the United States, and Michael also mentioned elections in Iran. So, Mitch, what is your take?
Well, so just to kind of build a little bit on what actually the indication of what you've been noting, as well as the future of the JCPOA in this regard. First, I want to also kind of build a little bit on what Michael was saying about in relation to the regime having to face some serious challenges going forward. Of course it will. But the question is, what is its track record on dealing with crisis internally and externally? It's to ramp up this kind of rhetoric, this we're alone rhetoric, and the rhetoric is usually followed by very aggressive policies, which is why in the last 3-4 weeks, you've seen a very aggressive kind of behavior of both Iran directly in the Strait of Hormuz again, trying to capture an American vessel, playing cat and mouse again with American ships in the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, you're seeing a ramping up of activity in Yemen. You're seeing, again, I mean, there's mixed messages here. There's been mixed messages from the regime in Tehran throughout this crisis about to what extent. I mean, the main narrative that bounces around the official channels in Iran is that COVID is actually an American disease that's spreading through Iran. So I don't see that this is going to be a platform of trust building or dialoguing afterwards. I think what the regime is trying to do is hunker down. They're going to narrative that they're defending the Iranian revolution and the Iranian people from these external forces like the United States. But what's more interesting, and I'll turn back to you, Valina, after this statement, but I think what's more interesting is the reaction to Iran's behavior in Europe, because I think that slowly, European states are coming to realize with greater certainty what kind of regime you're facing in Iran. And this week's banning of Hezbollah in Germany is a very good indication. It's not just symbolism. This is a black eye to Iran, which has has tremendously benefited from the Hezbollah presence in Germany over the last decades. And now that presence is gone, or at least gone underground. And this, I think, sends a very strong signal from Germany to Iran directly that your support for clandestine operations and groups in Europe will no longer be tolerated. I can see that this will have a cascading effect as well. Other countries around Europe are likely to follow suit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to amplify and build on Mitch's points and answer your question, Valina. I was going to bring up the example of Hezbollah in Germany as well, and it's quite significant when you think that Iran relies a tremendous amount on illicit trade to keep its economy afloat. So there's a lot of implications. But to answer your question, I don't think you can look at Iran in European relations and Iran-U.S. relations in isolation from what happens in the rest of the region. I think what you have is a Iran that's been weakened by COVID-19, but Iran is used to austerity. But I would argue that the COVID-19 has actually benefited Saudi Arabia and would put Saudi Arabia in a stronger position in the Middle East. And similarly, as long as the United States continues to provide its financial bailout for Turkey, Turkey is in a very strong position. So I agree with Mitch that Iran will, in the short term, very much try to pursue its its hand in the Middle East. In addition to Yemen, I would also point to Iran's activities on the islands between the United Arab Emirates and Iran that the United Arab Emirates claims, but Iran has announced that it's going to build housing on these disputed islands. So I think what Iran will do is press for weak points, especially as I said, Saudi. There are three regional alignments: Iran and its allies, the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt bloc, and then the third alignment, the Turkey-Qatar bloc. And as a result of these of COVID-19, I would argue with that the Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates bloc, particularly because of Saudi Arabia, is in a stronger position than it was before, and also the Turkey-Qatar relationship, with the proviso that it depends on relations between Ankara and Washington. So this puts Iran more in a box. It could potentially push Iran to be more accommodating with Russia, for example, in Syria, because Iran is in a worse situation, and it will need to compromise somehow. I think in terms of Mitch is correct, the European attitudes, but as we know, Europe itself is facing such a difficult economic situation where you have the southern European countries contracting, and even Germany contracting 5%, that it's not clear to me how much the Europe can do now to change the situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. That makes me move to the second questions block, which is related to the Gulf countries. As we witnessed, the countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council also faced dual shock, right? So on the one side, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but on the other side, they were very, very strongly hit by the collapse of the oil prices. And also, of course, we know that the region is very interconnected to China. So it is a kind of a cascading effect that had on this particular region because China was in a way also dealing with its own internal issues. And that's the expectation also for the next at least several months, right? Half of a year. So no demand shock on the supply side, shock on the demand side. So these kind of coupled problems are, being accelerated specifically for this region. And I would like to know what is your take on, modes of coordination, if there are any, between the Gulf countries during the COVID-19, and your expectations, whether there will be more cooperation, more coordination, or rather, once again, a kind of a escalation phase maybe within the Gulf countries. We know that there is still this, a block of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So how do you see this? And of course, what interests me particularly is what kind of implications this might have on Europe once again, because for Europe, this is the very, very geostrategic region linking the southern and eastern neighborhood. So everything that happens there is, has a direct impact also on Europe. So, Mitch?
Sure. So I think I'll leave the energy side of this to Michael, who's much more of a specialist in energy than I am. But I do want to, maybe as an energy point, I do want to stress that I'm not convinced that the oil crisis is so much of a crisis in the Gulf. I think it's just a blip. That's not only Saudi Arabia, but the GCC countries in general will come back stronger from this in just a few months from now. But I do want to focus on the COVID crisis as it impacts the Gulf countries, because it's been a very interesting. If you're taking a bird's eye view, you'll see some very interesting changes and developments in the countries. First and foremost, healthcare has been so quickly, and healthcare services have been so quickly mobilized that they turned COVID very early on into a national, not only security, but a national identity forming issue. All the Gulf countries, and if you just look at the number of infections versus the number of casualties because of the COVID in the Gulf countries, they've been so fast to react. They've opened their healthcare systems for not only citizens, but anybody who lives there. Sorry, there's a background. Anybody who lives there, they really sprung into action. If you see the videos, if you see how they've set up their hospitals, how they purchased the rest, basically they've looked at this as a national security and identity forming issue. So places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, they've always maintained anyways very good coordination between them, be it in energy, be it in security, but now it extends to healthcare. And I think that there'll be some very valuable lessons. I think that the early warning systems across the world failed, and we're playing catch up. Some places have been able to play catch up faster than others, but you see that they're willing to incur even economic stagnation or a downslide in order to provide their citizens for the kind of healthcare that's needed to walk them through this crisis. I deeply suspect as well that in the crisis, you're going to have a kind of new born of advanced research and developments in terms of dealing not only with pandemics, but medical research in general. And I think you're going to see the kind of innovation hub that's been slowly building up in and around the region is going to just skyrocket when it comes to medical research. Now, this is very interesting because for decades and for the last century, Europe was the heart of this. But Europe struggled much more because of the neoliberal policies in relation to healthcare and essentially the two-track system. Whereas in the Gulf, you really have, government organized healthcare system. So I think that this will be the biggest change that you'll see afterwards, this new innovation hub in medical research and development. I also wouldn't want to overstate their relationship to China in that front. I think for the most part, if sides have to be drawn, the GCC countries will always go back to their main alliance framework, which is the European countries and the United States. And as the economic and political lines are being drawn in the sand, the Gulf countries are gravitating, I think, more into or re-gravitating back to Washington. The Chinese model is not something that they necessarily want to follow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mitch.
Okay.
Michael.
Thank you, Mitch. It's very interesting comments, Mitch. Building on one point that Mitch said, the Gulf countries are transforming from regimes based on families to try to develop a national identity. We see this most prominently in Saudi Arabia with MBS and young people. And so what Mitch has pointed to will really help that project. I'd say Saudi Arabia comes out more powerful because if you look at foreign reserves in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is by far the leader. It's got 510 billion, according to the IMF. To give you a sense of who's next, Israel comes at 115 billion and the UAE at 100 billion. Saudi Arabia and that's not to include all the foreign assets that Saudi Arabia could liquidate. So they were able to weather this so-called oil Mageddon very well compared to all the others. And what that means is the other economies cannot easily start up, the vulnerable economies, Iraq, which we haven't talked about, which to me, because of the oil and the COVID-19, is going to be one of the trouble points. Iran, you can throw in countries like Algeria, all these vulnerable economies that are oil producers, they will not be able to invest in restarting their oil or maintaining their oil. And just to give you a sense, even if there is no growth in oil demand, the world needs to replace 6 million barrels per day per year just to keep, to compensate for declining fields. So all of that means there's going to be a boomerang effect in demand because consumer demand will pick up way ahead of how much these other producers will be able to start. And the country best poised to fill in that gap is Saudi Arabia. Second, Saudi Arabia is the only country that has significant spare capacity that and is willing to hold it at a cost, which means Saudi Arabia is the only country that can add or subtract supply at will. No other country can do that. So the COVID-19 and then the oil really confirmed Saudi Arabia's role as the central banker of oil, in fact, which was kind of on the skids since 2015 because of shale. So what you have, though, is Saudi Arabia's central position is confirmed, despite the Khashoggi murder and the bad press. You know, Washington and the European capitals turned to Saudi Arabia. No other country was able to do it. So Saudi Arabia came through. So there is, in a certain way, a certain kind of goodwill there, and realizing that Saudi Arabia is necessary. Furthermore, Russia learned a very important lesson. Russia learned it can't go out by itself. It can't go it alone. It started that price war, and Saudi Arabia emerged triumphant. So in that sense, Russia might have to do more geopolitical bargaining with Saudi Arabia. And so in that sense, you could argue that where the Gulf countries, their position vis-a-vis Russia is now much stronger. And of course, there's the issue of the succession crisis, Russian economy hard hit by COVID. So this puts Saudi Arabia in a very good position. Qatar also is in a good position because Qatar, its break-even point for the oil price is only $40 per barrel, and also the GCC and kind of did Qatar a favor because Qatar learned to survive in isolation. They learned to live without the Gulf countries, so they also will come out relatively okay. And that also has implications for their activities with Turkey, their relations around the Middle East. And in terms of Europe and the Gulf, what you see is France is the most important player with its naval base in the UAE and leading this maritime protection force. So when we look at the Gulf countries and their view of Europe, it will really come to what kind of leadership France will exercise in the Gulf and then in other parts of the Middle East, and how much the rest of the European Union will follow along with the French lead. And I'll stop there. And
can I just add something, Valina?
Yeah, sure.
So I just wanted to, on Michael's point, because he raised some very interesting, very important points. But I want to come back a little bit to Qatar, because even if financially they can make it through this, they will never be able to survive in any kind of isolation. And after the GCC crisis erupted, I think a lot of people around the rest of the GCC, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, even Kuwait and Oman, had expected some kind of concession to be made by Qatar. When that wasn't forthcoming, you got kind of like a kind of splits between those who say, you have to start negotiating with us, or there's no reintegration, or those like Kuwait and Oman that were willing to play a kind of neutral role in the crisis. But what Qatar did, and here's where I think that, and where I'll disagree with Michael a little bit, they're going to come out in a more difficult position precisely because of which company they keep now. You cannot separate Qatar's geopolitical relationship with Turkey and Iran from the way that others are viewing, for example, Iran and Turkey. And so right now it seems that the United States-Turkey relationship is back on track. They really have kind of reconciled the crises of last year, but still there's a lot of things in the unfolding. We don't know where this is going to take us quite yet. But when it comes to Iran, I don't think that Qatar is going to be able to reconcile its relationship to Iran and its relationship to the United States. At some point, it's going to have to choose. And I think also patience in Washington is going to be wearing more and more thin with a Qatar that is not willing to negotiate with its Arab GCC partners, traditional friends, traditional allies, but rather would work closer with Iran. And I think this is a very big problem in Washington. I think that people like Mike Pompeo will remember the emirs, the travel to Iran following the assassination of Soleimani, the Qatar black flag, the condolences that were sent, and they'll be asking questions about the reliability of their Qatar ally.
I agree with Mitch. Mitch, I don't think we disagree on the framing of this, but I would say that a point that I raised and that you reiterated, the Turkey-U.S. relationship will be important for the Qatar-U.S. relationship. That all the problems you cited vis-a-vis Iran and the U.S. for Qatar could be mitigated if the U.S. and Turkey have a greater alignment in various places like Syria, Libya, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This could create an avenue, at least for Qatar, to have a different relationship with Washington. It doesn't solve the problem with the Gulf countries. But again, this is the big question mark of what will happen with the U.S. and Turkey, and then of course that relates to Turkey and Syria and Turkey in Libya.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Which brings me to the next question, and that's the $1 million question of either or choices. This region is not the only one, and this region is not excluded from this dilemma. That is the dilemma of the systemic rivalry between the United States and China. How do you think that this systemic rivalry will impact the region? Mitch mentioned either or choices. Michael also pointed to balancing acts by several countries in the region. So we obviously see that the key players in the region are still the known ones. Next to the United States, we have a more assertive role by Russia, but we are also increasingly witness a kind of a dragon bear mode in the Middle East. That is an increasing presence by China, also as a trade partner, still only as a trade partner, and as a future infrastructure or connectivity, or call it like you want, business partner, but what interests me is to give me your view on your future scenario in the mid to long term. Do you expect an increasing role by the dragon bear in this region? Will this somehow lead to a kind of polarization in the region? In Europe, we've obviously witnessed an increasingly actions and measures by China and Russia, to capitalize on the COVID-19 crisis. It was a broad range of, spectrum of different kind of measures. Do you expect this kind of or similar kind of approach towards the Middle East and North Africa? And yes, and speaking of balancing acts, at some point, all of these regional actors will have to make a choice, right? With which of this kind of big systemic rivals they will go. So, what is your expectation on this? I mean, let's try to outline some kind of scenarios for the region. And lastly, what is the role of the European institutions? I mean, some European key members were mentioned, such as France, UK, but do you see actually a geopolitical commission being present in the Gulf region? I mean, we know that the Gulf countries have a strong interest in negotiating a trade deal with the European Commission. That means there is a strong interest in access to the common market. Can this be used as a kind of a geo-economic incentive, if you like, for the European countries also to step in, because obviously they are absent from the equation at the moment? Feel free to jump in to this ocean.
Mitch, do you want to go first? You've been going first every time. Would you like to go first?
I'll be a bit quick, anyways, because I mean I want to just first and foremost address the how we say the elephant in the room, which is the EU. No, we can't call it the elephant in the room. The mouse in the room, which is the geopolitical commission. When it was first articulated that the European Commission would be a geopolitical focused commission, I laughed out loud, actually, because they don't have the assets or the willpower. So it's just a rhetorical ploy to try to give the EU a larger global role to play. But if you don't build the assets and you lack the will, what are the expectations really? And so in this, I think the EU is missing a huge opportunity because of that introverted Europeanism. And rather than trying to find or participate in a real changing world, Europe rather expects the world to reflect an introverted Europe, which is also a little absurd. So we can put Europe on pause for now, as the institutions are really more than almost any other region. They're really wrapped up with COVID and trying to figure out how solidarity works in a crisis like this. And this is a really easy crisis. Bombs are not falling on our head while we have to maintain, social distance. This is a pretty easy crisis to sort out. And you would have expected much more solidarity amongst the member states than what we got. And this is opening up a Pandora's box of other problems that Europe is going to have to address before it starts looking for a way to engage in the world. So for the time being, I would take it off of this worldwide geostrategic question, and let it fold into more. NATO seems to be much more adept at global affairs. Now, most EU members belong to NATO, so it's really not posing a huge problem, but not all members do. And so, it's a fine line balancing between the European Union interests and the European members of NATO's interests. But again, it's not so pressing at this time. I would rather focus just for a few moments on the Gulf countries and in terms of the wider systemic challenges and pressures. Because the Gulf countries, whether we like to look at it in this way or not, the reality is that all the Gulf countries are forming a kind of new civilization, an Arab Gulf civilization. That civilization has its own kind of institutions, communication. They're pushing themselves into a different place than they came from even 15, 20, 30 years ago. So long gone is the idea of pan-Arabism, long gone is the pan-Islamism. We have a regionalism within the Arab world, in the Middle East, and the spearhead is the Arab Gulf countries. Now, speaking of which, there's a process going on because of the COVID-19 of a deglobalization of certain sectors. And this deglobalization, for example, in the healthcare sector, is going to have immense repercussions around the world, in Europe, in the United States, and even particularly in the Gulf. Because the Gulf countries, like others, have learned that you cannot outsource your security, for example, in healthcare. And you know, in Europe, this should have been obvious, but it's not been. More than 80% of our pills come from either India or China. That means two actors can essentially starve us of our, you know, medical equipment if necessary. And this is something that we have to, you know, come to terms with. We have to decouple our healthcare sector from the globalized world. And that means we're going to have to reproduce or reintroduce local or national level or even European level pharmaceuticals production sites. This is going to be costly. This is going to take a long time, but it has to be done. In the Gulf, they don't have to worry so much about the public expenditure to do so, because you have both the will, you have the finance, and now you're getting the research and development needed to make those kind of contributions. I was not surprised to learn that the UAE is one of the leaders in finding a medical solution to COVID-19. They have the young people, they have the innovation, and what they lack, they can just buy from, for example, Europe, because they're able to invest much more in these kind of sectors than European states are. And so I think that China lost a lot of trust with all of its partners around the world because of its failure to disclose the true nature of this disease, or the human contact points. They didn't pass on adequate information in a timely way to the WHO, and their disinformation campaigns have been focused not on the United States and Europe, but on global affairs. And I think that there will be a big pushback against China, be it in the United States, Europe, in the Gulf, in the Middle East in general, because the level of trust has gone very, very low as a result of its actions and inactions and disinformation. So I think when it comes to systemic change, we're going to see the flowering of new regional centers. And I think foremost among those will be the Gulf countries.
Thank you, Mitch. Michael?
I would agree with every point that Mitch mentioned. I'd also think that what Mitch is talking about will also affect the Israeli-Palestinian peace process with the Gulf countries. But I would, if you're speaking about Europe, you need to look at North Africa. The post-COVID-19 crisis, what you're having is a Europe that is more insular, that will actually aggravate the crisis, because as the European economies contract, the economic spillover will into North Africa will help destabilize the whole region. Because if you look, Italy contracting 9%, Spain 8%, France 7%. These are the major countries that are the export markets for North Africa. So you already have a civil war in Libya. You have a lot of instability. Egypt is going to have to be bailed out by the IMF. Turkey is looking relatively good, and Turkey has turned around the civil war in Libya, and what you have is Turkey, very strong in the Eastern Mediterranean. These, before the COVID-19, these were on the verge of erupting in an interlinked manner. That structure hasn't gone away. And I imagine it is going to be, these areas are going to be more vulnerable. Europe will be more vulnerable to the migration weapon from Turkey in this situation. And don't forget, what we just saw was the Greek land border. Now that the weather is warmer, sea travel is possible. And so we also we'll see just generally countries like Tunisia will have to ask for an IMF bailout. Algeria is in terrible shape. So but this also creates tremendous opportunity for Turkey, which already had its eyes on North Africa. So in terms of Europe, again, it comes down to France. France is the major player. France is in an antagonistic relationship. It's allied with Egypt. This brings in the United Arab Emirates. And so these countries, a lot for Europe will depend what France does, how much Italy gets behind France, and how much they coordinate with Cyprus and Greece. So, and we could see a very important split between the Northern European countries and the Southern European countries. Beyond that, there is an opportunity here for Russia and China. China has extensive presence in Africa and the Horn of Africa, which is a strategic area. But again, for the points that Mitch is raising, and also for the hit that China takes, this is really a tremendous opportunity. If Europe were not so inward-looking, it would actually have a tremendous opportunity. Again, it's an opportunity for Russia. But if Russia cannot, does not have the capability, a country like Turkey could potentially, or Turkey working in with the United States, fill in the gap. This is where we could see a new confluence of interests between Washington and Ankara. Would Washington prefer Moscow in Libya, or would they prefer Ankara in Libya? Obviously it depends on the terms. So what I see in the Mediterranean and North Africa is a tremendous amount of political flux, and a lot will depend on Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, France, and the United States, and Russia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. Mitch, do you want to add something, or if not,
No.
I would do a wrap up.
Yeah, I think go ahead. I think I made my final statements before.
Yeah. So, well, we actually managed in less than 60 minutes to give the big picture of a very volatile and very complex region, but also to present the main regional constellations, and then again also to reflect the current geopolitical and geoeconomic issues that will prevail following the COVID-19 crisis. And I hope that our watchers and listeners also got an idea of, and hopefully also got curious about the topic of our upcoming book on the dragon bear, together with Michel Belfer, Michel Tong, and other colleagues. We are currently writing a book on these issues, and more than that. That means that by the end of the year, we are going to publish a book that will very much reflect on exactly these issues. And if you don't have additional points that you would like to add to the conversation, I mean, I'm leaving it, we have like 5 more minutes because we started a little bit later. Please feel free to share your final inputs, but really in a very short manner.
Well, I just actually, if I could, I just wanted to thank you, Velina, for putting this together, and to thank your staff at the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy for going through the technical things. I know that now everybody's gone. We've all hibernated in our physical form, and we've migrated into cyberspace, and it's not easy to trying to do these things. So I appreciate so much the efforts that you and your team are doing to keep our debates alive and our discussion alive. And for those who don't know, our institutions are partnered together. So I do, on behalf of all of us in the EGIC, we say hello to you, and we really are so grateful for our collaboration and look forward to more of these kind of events and other events and activities. And also, to be honest, your moderation is always spot on, perfect. So thank you so much for all of your support.
Thank you, Mitch. This was a very nice, nicely put way of saying that I'm usually asking the inconvenient questions, but I think that this is the way how we actually can.
No, I meant it just like this.
More. And I'm really looking forward to deepening our cooperation between the institutes, of course, and also on a personal level. Like I said, it's a great collaboration that we are having right now, which will hopefully result with a very, very interesting and timely product, because we are seeing by the day how important these systemic issues are, and how we actually need a comprehensive understanding of the bigger picture, of the bird's eye view, if you like, on these matters. And I'm giving the floor to Michael for his final words.
Well, I would just like to echo what Mitch has to say. We can speak on and on about this. There's so many different aspects to cover, but I would just encourage everyone who's tuned in and listened to follow both AIES. Valina, you've been doing amazing things with these sessions, and the same Mitch's organization, EGIC, has been running wonderful and informative metaphors. And then I would like to thank Mitch for being such a wonderful partner in this session, and then especially you, Valina, for running everything with such intelligence and tact. You're a wonderful host, a wonderful questioner, with your pulse on the geopolitical trends over the horizon.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm really pleased to have you as a senior associate with the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy. You are also a very good partner to Mitch Institute, so it's a kind of a very, very good collaboration between the three of us. And like I said, we have other colleagues. Last week I had Harold Malmgreen and Albert Marku, who are also contributing to the book project. And at some point I will also have Rachel covering China. The idea of this digital talks is namely to open up the space and have a kind of a different way of conversation beyond the the usual institutionalized one, where we can really freely discuss matters of uncertainty, because we are living in the age of greatest uncertainty. Of course, this complicates the situation. It adds a lot more complexity to the issue, but it also offers tremendous opportunities for countries, for institutions, and for citizens. And we can add our modest contribution to not only to the debate, but also to the future of the relations of these countries, and also to the future of the understanding of how we should actually approach and understand these issues. And I'm really thankful to both of you for finding the time to be with me in the last 60 minutes. Please stay safe and sound. I'm really glad that Italy is finally doing a little bit better and is even opening up. And I wish of course, Michael, also a lot of success in his endeavors. He's busy with various projects right now, and is contributing to several institutions. And I'm looking forward to our hopefully rather soon than late conversation on those issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Galina.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.